Doris Wesley, who is a doctoral student with the Communication, Rhetoric, and Digital Media program at NC State. Her present research project involves using multimodal techniques to explore the mobilities, visual representation, and practices of internally displaced populations in the Global South, as well as creating a dispute system designed for government organizations. So welcome, Doris.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to share this virtual space with you all. I'm Doris Wesley, and my focus in this presentation is to advocate for a pluriversal diversality. Next slide, please. I will begin by highlighting that pluriversal diversality, also known as pluriversality, is a concept emerging from the decolonial theory that provides a counter-narrative to contemporary Western Eurocentric assumptions of the universal. This concept is pulled from Ramon Grossfogel's article titled Transmodernity, Border Thinking, and Global Coloniality, where he highlighted that a true decolonial perspective should not be based on the coloniality of power, nor should it be a linear universal approach where most ideas are thought of as if they are dominantly from the West. Instead, a decolonial perspective means having a pluriversal, diverse lens that embraces multiple and insightful thoughts, projects, cosmologies, and knowledge of critical indigenous thinkers, especially those from the Global South. So embracing this approach will invariably give sociopolitical and cultural momentum to media studies and other epistemological projects. Next slide, please. So to begin, I'd like to highlight that I'm speaking from a position of being an African descent with an international orientation, who is multilingual and interculturally aware. I am also a cisgender woman who has access to Western education, technology, and also approaches my work from Afrocentric and Afrofuturism perspectives. Next slide, please. So going by the theme of this panel, I'd like to unpack what decolonial knowledge should look like in a pluriversal world. Does it really exist? Is it possible, or is it just another academic buzzword? What does the search for original perspectives and sources beyond Eurocentrism look like? In an attempt to answer these questions, I am drawing from my reflections, experiences, and some of the challenges I encountered while completing my weekly course assignments and working on my research project in our seminar last fall. My research highlighted the need to decolonize digital access, its use, and outcomes by exploring how some internally displaced persons in Africa continue to experience the effect of digital colonialism and hegemony. In that research work, I argued that simply making information communication technologies, also known as ICTs, available to this population does not automatically close the digital divide gap. Instead, such a digital humanitarianism assumption takes on a modern form of exercising coloniality of power. Sadly, during the process of searching for materials and content for both my weekly assignment submissions and my final research in the seminar, I noticed that many scholarly articles on media infrastructures in Africa were viewed from an Euro-Western perspective and hardly centered around indigenous or African cultural values and beliefs. In fact, most of the information that addressed historical and contemporary media studies, as well as ICT's content within Africa, were largely written by Euro-Western authors and only a few indigenous African authors. So apparently, in the attempt for some Euro-Western authors to provide solutions to some of Africans' infrastructural challenges, they often either view Africa as a homogeneous bloc or propose solutions from what Bachki's Singapore called digital savior complex, that is reinforcing existing colonial hierarchies between the savior and the saved. I like what Zoe Todd, an indigenous feminist, stated, and I quote, "It is easy for those within the Euro-Western academy to advance and consume arguments that parallels discourses and indigenous context without explicitly nodding to them, or by minimally nodding to indigenous intellectuals and political players, end of quote. By doing so, some Euro-Western thinkers continue to replicate original indigenous African thought or produce an unfair representation of their reality. As such, the question here is, whose narrative is being told? By whom and for who? Next slide, please. While carrying out my research, I also noticed some issues with language and interpretations. The language used to communicate the research information on how Africans interact with infrastructures and media technologies were all written in European or Western language, which is English, and hardly were any of the materials written or spoken in an African language. Africa is a continent with a very high linguistic diversity, with almost 2,000 African languages. So when we have academic materials mostly written in only English, it then means that access to information becomes limited to non-English speaking Africans. And I showed on this slide a quote written by Eme and Bagus, and I quote, "Until these writers and their Western midwives accept the fact that true African literature must be written in African languages, they would be merely pursuing a dead end, which can only lead to sterility, uncertainty, and frustration. You cannot cram African literature in a small, neat definition. I don't see African literature as one unit, but as associated units. In fact, the sum total of all the national and ethnic literature of Africa," end of quote. This quote should inform us that epistemological projects and about media infrastructures in Africa can never be complete without being communicated in an African language or African languages, or centered around African cultural experiences, values, and interpretations. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the challenges surrounding the reachability and access to some quality media studies materials produced by indigenous African scholars, I also discovered that it was very challenging to find them in open access journals. In fact, some journals where some of the African scholarly articles and materials are published are barely known to or used by the majority of our global audiences. For example, an academic site called African Journals Online actually hosts about 560 journals. And on this platform, half of its journal has open access, while the other half has closed access. But what I observed from exploring this site is that all published articles were written in English. Also, the majority of the articles with closed access were written by Euro-Western authors, while the open access articles were mostly written by African-based academics. Sadly, publication in most of these African journals hardly get international recognition or command a kind of online presence by most non-African audiences or scholars, unlike its Euro-Western counterparts, which is highly recognized and largely applauded. Such unfair metrics makes it challenging for emerging researchers who pride themselves in putting their work in such indigenous journals to reach a larger global audience. And some of the factors that I was able to see that continue to hinder the access to media information about and for Africans include, but is not limited to, intellectual property rights, challenges with infrastructures, that is connectivity, server and software, minimal reachability, underfunding of African-based journals, and a lack of acceptance of African-based thinkers or academics and their indigenous perspective. Next slide, and my final slide. Yes, so this decolonial archive map, which was created in our seminar, shows the number of decolonial infrastructural materials that were obtained from the African continent, as you can see, and other parts of the world. What should these findings communicate to us now that we're listening and looking at this? As Todd puts it, and I quote, "These ongoing challenges continue to get us to think of how we can adopt a decolonial approach that incorporates and acknowledges the critical scholarships of indigenous African thinkers whose work and labor inform many current trends in Euro-Western scholarships, activism, and socio-political discourse," end of quote. So taking such a pluriversal approach where all voices are heard and recognized within academic discourses and all ideas are centered around each national and ethnic experience is a huge step to breaking the shackles of the coloniality of power. So with this approach, I believe, we can begin to move towards a conceptually and practically new realms. Thank you so much.